In section 1 of this lecture, we talked about mostly Europeans and in particular Spanish reasons for dominating over the Indians, and I left off talking about moral justification. So how does that relate to the slave trade in Africans? This was carried out first by Europeans, especially Spanish, Portuguese, and then later British, who largely went to the Kingdom of Benin. We know more and more about this in recent years because of genetic analysis. Well, they could tell themselves that by giving manufactured goods to the people of Benin, and the Benin Kingdom was trading slaves themselves. These Benin Africans were slave traders. The Europeans could think that it's just part of business, and they didn't have to feel very guilty. But we still have to figure out how they could justify the Middle Passage. You can see in the picture how crowded these boats were. We talk about the Middle Passage being the 1 to 3 or 4 month journey from unloading from the port in West Africa to finally arriving at the destination, most often in the Caribbean islands or Brazil. You have to really think hard about what it takes in your mind to psychologically do this to people. You could say that, well, they're not really humans. They are a different type of species, almost like animals. And this was one way you could try to be scientific. We have to be honest. The United States, as a political entity, was created from the institution of slavery. It is absolutely vital to the functioning of the country. I'll explain a little bit more. When the first settlers, and now we're going to focus just on the British story, okay, basically. The people who came from Europe and landed in places like Virginia. And we're going to focus on the South for now. The South means Georgia, the Carolinas, and places like that. Well, there was a lot of land at first, because as we said, many of the Indians died from disease or from war. And the white settlers didn't mind sharing land with the first black settlers. Did you know this? At first, you could be a former black slave and win your freedom and then own land and actually own slaves yourself. So that's because the first slaves were both black and white. And they didn't use the word slave, they used the term indentured servitude, which basically said you could work for 7 to 10 years, and after you're done working, you can have your own land. And this system worked for the first few decades in the United States area because, like I said, there's enough land and not so much competition. So our case study here of Anthony Johnson, who was captured in the Angola area around 1620, became freed and started his successful tobacco farm, and he owned white and black servants. However, by the time of his death, around the 1670s, the situation had changed completely. Now, in order to try to understand this, I want to look at trends in the use of language. So just a minute here, please take a look with me. I'm going to use something called Google Ngram Viewer, and you can use this to chart the progress of word usage in English language text. So if you take a look at this sample chart, I just put in the words Japan and China. If you start looking from the 1550s, you can see a consistent trend where China, as the red line, is mentioned much more than Japan until we get to about the 1980s, where perhaps because of Japan bashing or American nervousness about the Japanese economic takeover, created a lot of books about Japan. Okay, that's just the example. Now let's look at what I put in here. I used the terms black, Negro, and African American. And by the way, these are case sensitive. So that means when we use the word black, we are only using capital B, black, which is most often used to refer to people and not just the color black in general. Well, looking at first African American, we can see that this is a very new word. It was basically never used until, the 1980s? Almost 1990s? Okay, well, if we look at the difference between Negro and black, black has almost always been used more until about the 1940s, when a sort of civil rights movement was getting kicked off and the word Negro was used a lot more than black. But let's look in particular at the 1660s to see that for some reason, for a short period of time, there are so many mentions of the word black. What's going on there? Now, I didn't do any research into this, but I hope that I'm correct. In the United States colonies, the British colonies at the time, there was a lot of laws being written about what it means to be a slave. And it was in this period, the 1660s, where so many laws in areas like Virginia were being written that specifically said blacks are slaves. Whites cannot be slaves. This is a very important psychological moment for Americans as well. This is when they started to become white rather than English or Irish or whichever ethnic roots they had. They started to trade that heritage for the right to be white so they could compare themselves to blacks. And doing this, you can see almost as a sacrifice to gain political and economic dominance over another group. They sacrificed a certain amount of their heritage and they traded ethnicity for race. Okay, English or Irish or German, this is an ethnicity. White or black, this is a race. And this is the beginnings of the creation of the racial system as it is in the United States. Alright, so we've established that the beginning economy of the United States was built upon slave labor, which produced raw materials, which were manufactured in the North. Going ahead 100 years to the Proclamation of 1763. This is when England, here represented by King George III, England told the colonists that they may not expand westward across this line. And this made the colonists very upset because they wanted more and more land, of course. And this is one of several actions which England did that eventually upset the Americans so much that they decided to have a revolution. And officially the date is 1776, July 4th. That's what we call our Independence Day. This is when people like these two, George Washington and Ben Franklin, helped to write this document. The principal author was Thomas Jefferson, who, like George Washington, owned dozens of slaves. Both of these men are from Virginia, and they were planters, growing things like tobacco or cotton. They absolutely depended on access to large amount of land and slave labor. So this revolution for liberty, which George Washington loves, was also to protect slave-owning system. Now there is an interesting relationship between American idealism and economic practicality. Economics, America is a nation of lawyers and bankers, really. And so, on paper, you write a lot of nice words about liberty that sound very good for the court. And that's one thing that Ben Franklin could do. And I think in his case, he really did believe it. And people like George Washington could talk about liberty and feel good about it, even though he had plenty of slaves. In fact, this guy here, who made the phrase which every American knows, "Give me liberty or give me death." Same story, Patrick Henry was a Virginia planter who owned more than 70 slaves. All of these people were central to the decision to declare independence from England. We can imagine that the document, the Declaration of Independence, which starts by saying, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." I don't think they saw blacks and Indians as men, or they didn't believe what they wrote. These are the two options, and you can help decide on the discussion forum which was which. All right, I'll see you next week as we talk more about American expansion westward.